Once upon a time, there were two little girls named Deb. One little girl grew up to be a preacher while the other grew up to be a pagan, and they both grew up to be the very best of friends. Join the preacher and the pagan as they take a fresh look at Christianity, from the inside out and the outside in. Hello and welcome to The Preacher and the Pagan. I'm Deb Bodwin in sunny Arizona, and Deb Suttard, how you doing up there in the Great White North?
Oh, it's not white yet. We've got a couple months left, but we're doing good. We're doing good. Fall's in the air for sure.
Oh, bless. Hey, it's under 100 degrees. That's like 38 for you guys up in Canada.
Okay, we've had a week of about 1920, so I can't translate. You can figure that one out. You've always done that math. It does. Oh, it does.
Girl, I asked Miss Alexa to convert it before we got on the phone. So
oh, that's funny.
And I whispered because I don't want her eavesdropping on our conversation.
I can understand that. I have a similar relationship with Siri.
I get it.
Yep.
So today we are talking about parables. We're going to do something fun this time. We're doing a two-parter.
Yeah, there's so many parables. It's such a fun subject because no one seems to have the same opinion. Like no two people have the same opinion, so it's kind of wild.
Well, yeah, and we, as much as we're on team metaphor, the subject of parables is really right in our wheelhouse because parables are just one of the most time-honored ways of teaching in pretty much all human cultures since the dawn of time. We're one of the few modern Western culture. We're one of the few, we're in this really dark age of not really respecting the use of parable and mythology and metaphor as a teaching tool, even though we're still subjected to it. We're human animals. We're going to respond to it, but we're not doing it knowingly like our ancestors did.
No, not at all. We're trying to look at things and make them too literal. The joy of story is that it's story, and it teaches you by virtue of a million different ways it can make you feel, and over a lifetime your perception of that story will change. But if you try to drill down and make it too literal, you not only lose the magic, but you kind of lose the point. And yeah, right, we're in a society that drills down way too much and loses some of the joy. I was preaching the other day about this woman who is hunched over, and right away my brain goes, is this osteoarthritis? And I have to stop myself because that's not the point. Who cares really what is going on? There's a story there. And that's something we really need to get back to, like not jump to the first logical assumption about what's going on. And the parables are beautiful because they not only can speak to us in the 21st century, but they spoke really profoundly in the first century. And they demand that we understand them in the first century to really understand them in the 21st. So that's like a lot of intellectual work to go on to just enjoy the fact. And if you don't want to put that in, you can still enjoy the gotcha element of the parables at the end, just for their own value.
And for those of us who are still trapped in this idea of, oh, you've got to have a logical reason. In preparing for this episode, I was reading an actual NPR article, National Public Radio here in the US, about the neuroscience of using mythology, parables, that sort of thing. And what it does is the imagery in storytelling actually activates the emotional centers of our brain. They say that when you're listening to a story, your brain waves actually sync with the storyteller. So what happens is you're telling a story, you've got Jesus telling a story to his followers. And as he's telling that story, their brain waves are actually syncing to his. They're getting on his frequency. And this is something that storytelling does very well, which is why, like, let's say you want to get somebody to stop drinking. You talk about like Alcoholics Anonymous. The most powerful thing about um, Alcoholics Anonymous is sharing the stories, because that actually affects the emotional centers of the brain and actually convinces, it actually triggers more of a will to change behavior and to conform to or change a point of view or belief. Whereas statistical things will, in some ways of learning, linear thinking is a lot more effective. But when you want to create change, when you want to change an attitude or a belief or a behavior, the most powerful way to teach and affect change is through storytelling. It's because our brains are wired that way. And our ancestors knew this, even without MRIs and CAT scans and all of that. They knew it. And they based their cultures, whether it was, Iron Age Africa or, the indigenous cultures of North America. All of the indigenous cultures of the world use storytelling as a way of teaching the culture, teaching the children, and creating beliefs and society.
That's really fascinating. Yeah, I can see that. I find when I'm writing fiction, as opposed to writing nonfiction history, that people are more willing to hear the history through story, through fiction, mm-hmm. and more resistant if I just put a bunch of facts and stuff in non-fictional stuff. So it's really interesting that psychologists have actually done some study on this. Because if you look at every culture around the world, mm-hmm. Our creation mythologies, every single culture, it's all story based, and many of them are really similar, which is I find something really fun anyway. But mm-hmm. yeah, this notion of story, it invites you in. It's kind of like a warm blanket that you can curl up into, and there's comfort there. There's probably a reason why grandparents, our favorite memories of grandparents, are curling on their lap when they mm-hmm. tell us stories about things.
Well, and look at the popularity of things like TED Talks and, these podcasts that tell these stories where you're getting these moments in a lifetime. And I remember when I would listen to NPR on the way home, and they would have some of these stories that I would literally stop in my car and sit in my car for 10 minutes after I'd gotten home from my commute, because I wanted to hear the end of the story. Mm-hmm. And Jesus knew that, and the greatest leaders knew that. The greatest spiritual leaders know that stories, because it brings you, your synapses align, your brain aligns, your heart aligns, all of this aligns. This is the best way to get a message across to human beings, because we are emotional creatures, and we are storytelling creatures.
And the connection is just so much easier. Yeah, yes. It's one of the things I put on my website for Lent is how to Lent with kids and how to Lent for teens. Mm-hmm. And with kids, I make a calendar where every day in Lent, they're getting an opportunity to read another parable. Mm-hmm. And most of them are in the Gospel of Luke, which is really kind of fascinating, because when you look at the four Gospels, Luke is the social justice gospel. Mm-hmm. This is the gospel. Well, I'm assuming a male author, though I shouldn't. The writer of Luke is wanting people to engage and get involved, whereas the writers of Mark and Matthew and John have different agendas, still telling the same story, but they've got different focuses on what's going on. Luke is the one that is the call to action. And in Luke, you'll also often find parables where there's two parables side by side, one with a male focus and one with a female focus. And you find this often through Luke. So like we'll find the parable of the lost coin and the lost sheep are side by side. The lost coin is about a woman and the lost sheep is about a man finding the sheep that is lost from his 100. And Luke continuously does this. And it's a real way to pull in both women and men into the entire ministry and show them that they're all part of the big picture.
So basically, if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that Luke will put in two parables teaching the same message, but he'll gear one towards women and one towards men so that everyone gets the same message in a language that is designed to be the most effective with them.
Well, exactly. And I mean, this is one of a bugaboo that you and I have talked about long before we decided to do a podcast, that if you do not see yourself in story, you do not know how to take that story and influence yourself. TV story or a fan fiction story or a movie story or a book or wherever. If you only have one type of protagonist, the people who are like that protagonist, they feel the connection right away. But if you are not that protagonist, you feel like you're outside of the story, that it's not really for you. This is why representation, of course, is so important.
Yes.
And Luke kind of gets that right off the hop. And he's the only writer of parables. Again, I'm using Luke as a he. The Lucan parables are the only ones that make an attempt at including different protagonists with the same type of message, so everybody can feel that they're represented.
That's impressive, and that would go really well with the idea of Luke as a social justice gospel.
Precisely. Yeah. So we get a lot of stories in Luke that we're not going to see anywhere else, because there's a lot of parallels in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but Luke has a whole section of engagement in storytelling that's not found in Matthew and Mark, which is it's part of the reason why that gospel is my favorite. I like the kind of get your hands dirty and get on with things.
Well, and it would make sense if the other three are designed to teach a history, whereas the whole purpose of Luke's is a call to action. Parables are the way to get people to call to action. They're the best types of call to action. And it makes sense. It makes sense. Yeah. It sounds like whoever the author or authors of this gospel were, they understood human psychology, and they understood, even before the word psychology even existed, they understood human nature and what it takes to get someone to get out of their doldrums and get out of their ruts and say, look, we can make change. We're an oppressed people, but look, here, these are people like me, and they're making changes and making choices. And yeah. I think the best leaders, the best politicians, for good or for ill, the best politicians understand that.
Yeah. And to be fair to the other gospels, like there's parables throughout all of them. But they're all focused on, like Matthew is focused on getting your own spiritual house in order first, so you can act out of that. Where Mark is very quick, kind of, here's a story, now we're moving on. Mark is very fast. And then John is focused.
He wasn't a liberal arts major, was he?
No. And Luke, for Luke's sake, Luke actually is the author of both Luke and Acts. And for the longest time, people thought that he was that the writer of Luke was a doctor, because there's so many healing stories. But we've now come to accept that there's no real medical sensibility about the Gospel of Luke. There's just he's considered now the first historian of the Christian church, writing both Luke and Acts. So again, history, l'histoire, the story, it's all part of the same parcel. Getting people engaged and making them feel like they're part of something bigger is a huge part of Luke.
And it's interesting, because what you're looking at here is that different types of stories affect different types of actions and different types of reactions. And a good teacher will understand what type of story works best in what type of situation to enact what type of change. And it seems like they all have their own agendas, and they understood the audience that they were teaching to well enough to find the stories that were correct. In order, it sounds so manipulative, but it's not. It's just good
No,
leadership.
it's well, exactly. It's knowing the lay of the land because every gospel was written at a different point in history, at a different geographical place, with slightly different population. It's not like every gospel was trying to get to the same person like it is today. So all of that would have influenced them, and also the stories on the ground would influence the differences in the four gospels. So the people would see themselves reflected. And many times I tell people when I'm preaching that every time you're looking at the Bible, you have to keep 3 time periods going on simultaneously. The time when Jesus was actually teaching these people, the time when we are reading and learning these lessons and hearing them, and the time when they were actually being written. So there could be things going on in that community that look back at Jesus' teaching, and it's brought in a way that speaks to what is happening in the contemporaneous with the writer, to help solve that problem, so that it might not have been a big deal in the year 40, but it'll be huge in the year 90 as they look back and say, okay, this teaching actually was almost foreshadowing and applies to what we're going on now. So we have to work this a little bit harder than we might have before when it really wasn't as applicable. It's just kind of an interesting curiosity. So there's a lot of that going on too. You cannot read anything in any ancient text, not just Christian or Hebrew texts, but anything in any of the ancient worlds, without recognizing how influential their contemporaneous world was to the stories and the outcome that was hoped for.
Exactly. And that's one of the things, when I was reading about the indigenous mythologies, that they used tropes and metaphors and imagery that was meaningful to their immediate culture, and those metaphors matter, and those have specific meanings that were meant to incite specific responses, which circles us back to what we're always saying is context. You cannot read a parable from the year 32, current era, with the eyes of a person in the year 2021 or 2022. You have to know the context, otherwise you're going to misinterpret the meaning. And it may just be a slight misinterpretation, or it may be a wildly unreliable reading of the parable, depending on the context.
Yeah. A great example of that is the prodigal son. When we have the scene where the prodigal comes back home and the father is running out to him, it has been interpreted for so long as this loving return. The father is so excited and racing out. That's a very 20th, 21st century interpretation. Put it in first century context, and a Hebrew father would not be running anywhere. He was running out to protect his son from the neighbors who were gunning for this kid. See, and that little thing that changes so much about these people.
When I was thinking about doing this episode, we were going to talk about misinterpreted parables. That was top of my list, was the prodigal son. And I want to explore that in the next episode when we talk about individual parables, because that, to me, in my little 20th, 21st century, that was always to me like, what the hell? Why would he do this? This kid was a skunk. I mean, let him back, but don't throw him a party or anything. And it has a lot to do, again, with context, because we're seeing it in a very different light than a contemporary of Jesus would have seen that.
Absolutely. And part of part of our challenge is that uh, we don't bring our best game to Christian history or biblical history. We kind of
You can take the Christian and biblical adjectives off, honey.
Well, I've actually seen some people bring better analysis to other focuses on history when it comes to, and I've watched many documentaries that as soon as they hit biblical or Christianity stuff, they get lazy. So we are continuing on various assumptions without even looking at them. And I mean, one of the things, one of the joys I get in preaching is that I get to open up worlds to people that they had never heard before, primarily because the same old basically is passed on from generation to generation, and assumptions are not challenged. And one of my favorite authors, I was telling you before we even started this, I had to grab my favorite book. My favorite author is Amy Jill Levine. She is phenomenal. If I have to sit at the feet of anyone, it's going to be her. And she's a Jewish biblical historical scholar who works in first century. And she'll very freely say, if you want good understanding of the first century, you have to work with the Christian scriptures because they are the best preserved writings of that era. And she's the brilliant mind that brings in so much of the cultural context that Christians have either glossed over or hadn't even realized needs to be included in your interpretation of it. And she's written a book, Short Stories by Jesus, which is about the parables, some of the parables in Luke. And I completely piggyback on her research in some of the stuff. And afterwards, people will come to me after sermons. It's like, now it makes sense. Okay, I didn't get X. So now, as you put it that way, now it makes more sense. I don't know why the church is so lazy about that particular step, because it is so meaningful to congregations to make those connections so they again can enter these old familiar stories with new eyes and get something different out of them.
I wonder, what is it, a chicken and the egg thing? Is it because they got lazy that they stopped teaching it, or did they stop teaching it? I blame a lot of this on the plague, the bubonic plague.
I think that actually the responsibility is more about majority culture. We've talked about this before. When you're a minority, you have to work at who you are. You have to work at your identity. When you're the majority culture, everything's done for you. So you don't really have to work at too much. And so Christianity has been the majority viewpoint in the Western world for so long. I think people are just so lazy, assuming that they think they have all the answers and they just keep moving on. Kind of like in a patriarchy, male predominance is just assumed. But when you drill down, men have done very little work on men. Very little work on men history. In the meantime, women have got huge banks of scholarship on women in history and women's organizations and women's faults and women's successes. I mean, half a library could be just on the women's scholarship, and the men haven't done it. Same as there's huge amounts of scholarship on Black culture and Asian culture. There's very little done on white culture because it's just assumed as normative. So I think that's a large part of it. It's the laziness of the majority.
Okay.
But yeah, the plague can kind of tossed in there somewhere.
I'd say that
it changed Western thought for a whole lot of reasons.
Well, and you know what, this is my theory. Okay. So you got the whole church, right? And back during the bubonic plague, it was just the Catholic Church. This was before the Protestant Revolution. So you got two types of priests, right? You got the good priests who believe the Bible, they believe the teachings of Christ. They're going out there, they're catering to the sick and the poor and the needy, and they're getting the plague and dying. Now, the jerk priests who are like, I'm only here because I'm the second son of a nobleman, and he didn't want me trying to destroy his rightful heir to get the money. And I'm not going out and dealing with those filthy plague people. These are the people who survive. And in a single generation, you have wiped out 80-90% of all the good priests. And who's left running the show? And then suddenly you have a very strong imbalance of the more crass or corrupt or less people who aren't there because they are really truly called to be there. I mean, I'm not saying that there are no priests left after the plague who were actually called to be there. I'm just saying that the majority of the ones that survived to stay in power were probably not the ones who were thinking about the poor and the weak and the sick and the outliers.
Yeah, you got a really good point there. Yep.
You say nothing like a good global pandemic to shake up the core of foundation of society there, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
There. Hey, got a little deep there. Sorry about that. A little dark, but
no, I think that actually probably does pertain because a whole lot changes after a society goes through something dark and dismal. It's one of the cool things about the Christian Church. If I could just take this an aside, because you know, and I we never do asides in our conversations.
No, we're very strict,
very
sticking
focused
to the plan.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
Choked there a little bit, did you?
I'm just still choking over the idea of us having a plan.
Yeah, I know. But it's really interesting seeing all of the articles in religious circles emerging right now about how the number one group of people leaving the church is right-wing evangelicals in the American context. And how there's a rise in conservatism around the world, but if you just scratch underneath a little bit, you see it's all American money funding that. And how all of these social organizations with a root in Christianity that want nothing to do with the institutional church, but are still functioning and doing their thing, and even more prolific now than they were just even 5 or 10 years ago. It's like, yeah, that's tracking. That's exactly how history deals with the pandemic. It's kind of cool.
I would like to apologize on behalf. I am not personally responsible for this, but I feel that, like, just by mere proximity to these psychopaths, and yeah, I'm going to use that word, I want to apologize to the world at large. And now they're going to all Natalie Main me and start taking my records and crushing them. And okay, maybe not. I'll stop.
Not quite. Yeah, you're not a Christo-fascist, which I came to find out was actually a word that was coined 10 years ago.
Really?
It started to be used more in the last six months to a year. But yeah, it was coined 10 years ago. Yep. Christo-fascist. I think it's a fantastically accurate. Well, and you know the heck out of calling them evangelicals, because evangelicalism is so much bigger.
Well, they have taken a term and they have really just warped it. I mean, and that is what this group of people do. They take really benign terms and they twist them into the exact opposite of what their intention is.
Yeah. And they don't deal with the stories. Have you noticed that, coming right back to our topic du jour? They do not seem to appreciate the parables of, like, Lazarus and the poor man, the Lazarus and the rich man, rather, who Lazarus, who is not the brother of Mary and Martha. I want to make that particularly clear. Okay. A different Lazarus, different man named Lazarus, who was given an opportunity to see a new kind of world with the flip of social wealth, because he was suddenly in a place of luxury and benevolence. And the rich man, who was struggling now in a life that did not give him the opulence he assumed, wanting now Lazarus to help him. And the message basically is like, no, you had your chance. You're not going to hear that of the people who are going to preach the health and wealth gospel, which is a quoted term.
Yeah, I'm hearing that a lot more.
Yeah, you're not going to hear. That's the other part of Luke, all the economic analysis. You're not going to hear that taught in a world that does not assume humility in their leadership. And parables also assume a level of humility, assume a level of comeuppance, of social change and surprise. And we'll get into a couple of those examples in our next half. But that's one of the beauties of the parables as well. It's not just simple stories. The stories that Jesus was telling have a twist to them that we don't necessarily grasp in the 21st century, but the first century people would have heard them and wait a minute, and snapped out of their comfort of hearing a story and like, this is new, this is different. I have to think about this,
process this.
Yeah.
And one of the things when you're talking about context, you're also talking about completion or the wholeness of it. You can't just pick and choose and this is what's happening a lot, and I'm seeing, and I don't just see it in the Christian sphere. I see it all over the place right now. You can't just pick and choose the stories that further your agenda. I mean, you can, but you're not going to get the whole truth of it. Mm-hmm. And I see it a lot in politics. I'll see it in people who will they'll tell anecdote after anecdote after anecdote, leaving out the full context because the full context does not further their agenda.
Right. Yeah. It's like looking at one part of the picture and blanking out the rest or cropping out the rest.
Exactly.
And that's one of the things when you get to the parables of Jesus, there's no real cropping out. There's like the parable of the Good Samaritan, for instance. Everybody wants to connect with the Good Samaritan. We even have laws about that in both of our countries and around the world. And the assumption is always that the priest and the rabbi, or the priest and the legal official that walk by are representing an old world that doesn't love or doesn't care, or they don't want to get engaged, when the fact of the matter is that in that culture, they would have heard a story that starts, the rabbi did this, or the priest did this, and then the legal person did this. They would expect like Pharisee or Sadducee as their third person. Mm-hmm. So to hear a Samaritan, who was the most hated person for the Hebrew culture, to be in Jesus' story, that was the shock. Not what happened, but the fact that that person was actually there would have totally rung their story upside down. And they would have had to listen in a different way. And mm-hmm. Jesus was not leaving that part out, wasn't making it comfortable, it wasn't going to be like a fireside chat. Suddenly, they had to think about what he was saying in a totally different way. So story might be the invitation in, but then the real teaching is kind of like a 1-2 punch. The real teaching came when they heard what they were not expecting. Exactly. And that's something I find with modern storytelling. We don't tell what's unexpected. You can predict way too much is going on because people do adjust it to their own agenda and to their own push. And that's something that a really good parable, a really good story doesn't do. A really good story does shake you up.
Exactly. And that's whether you're reading science fiction or a good novel, or you're telling a story in a teaching capacity. The truly good stories are the ones that cause you to think, that cause you to question your long-held beliefs, not change your long-held beliefs, but put them to a rigorous test.
Yeah.
And a lot of people don't want to put their beliefs to a rigorous test. I don't want to put my beliefs to a rigorous test. It's uncomfortable. It's painful. Yeah. We like our little boxes. We like our ruts. Yeah.
But change is not going to happen if we're comfortable.
The challenge is to go to those places that we don't want to look at because they make us uncomfortable, and to find the nugget of truth there. I cannot wait. I'm very excited about our next episode when we really dig deep into some of these, because I got questions, honey.
Good.
because I grew up on the parables, and I remember as a little kid not being being able to ask the questions like, this doesn't make any sense. What? Mm-hmm. And when I did, it's a matter of faith, or they just gave some platitude that didn't really satisfy my curiosity. So I am really, truly looking forward to the next episode when we go.
Yeah, I am too. I really love it. And again, total shout out to Amy Jill Levine. Like a lot of, I'm standing on her shoulders with a lot of the stuff.
Would you give, I'd love to get a couple of links that I can put in the show notes if people want to read her stuff. Is it readily available, or is it more scholarly work, or is it like you can get it on Amazon?
Oh, you can get it on Amazon. I have been told by people that have picked up the book I'm looking at, particularly called Short Stories by Jesus, that it's a demanding read. So because I'm a scholar, I really can't assess its readability. Okay. I think it's very easily accessible. So it's probably somewhere in between, a bit of a challenge, but it's not like I'm asking anybody to read Calvin or Luther or Augustine.
I'm not.
It's definitely people accessible, I think.
Well, then I think this would be a good point for us to wrap up our general discussion.
Yep.
And we will come back next time with some really deep dives into the parables.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, Deb, thank you again, as always, for this fabulous conversation. I appreciate it.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I always love doing these with you because you have such a different perspective and different set of questions than I have. It's challenging. It's wonderful.
And then every once in a while, that's a good thing, right? Okay.
Oh, all the time, it's a good thing. Yes.
Well, I want to thank our listeners once again for joining us, jumping down this rabbit hole. And I am Deb Bodwin in the United States.
Yeah, and I'm Deb Suttard in Canada.
And you are listening to The Preacher and the Pagan. And thank you very much for joining us. I'll talk to you later, Deb.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to The Preacher and the Pagan with Deborah Suttard and Deborah Bodwin. This podcast is a two-lady podcast production in conjunction with The Barefoot Evangelist. Our producer and sound editor is Catherine Gordon. Our theme music was composed by Deborah Bodwin. You can reach us at thepreacherandthepagan@gmail.com or by visiting our website at barefootevangelist.ca/podcast.